If you stood on the muddy, wind-blasted eastern coast of Britain, near the low-lying fields of Suffolk, all you would see was endless grey sea meeting endless grey sky. The landscape was unremarkable, flat, marshy, crisscrossed by hedges and ancient drystone walls. There was no sign of the technological battlefield that raged just beneath the surface. No name, no coordinates. Just an empty field on Britain's eastern coast. The nearest village was a cluster of thatched roofs and a pub dating back to the Armada, its occupants blissfully unaware that a few hundred yards away, the fate of the Western Alliance was being decided by men listening to static. This patch of earth, leased under a fictitious agricultural research grant, concealed the most secret listening post in the entire United Kingdom. It was designated simply as Unit 38B, on confidential Whitehall papers. To the 30 men and women who lived and worked within its confines, it was simply the station. Above ground, the station was a deceptive camouflage. A few dilapidated sheds that looked like storage for farm equipment. Alone, rusted tractors sitting permanently in the corner of a muddy yard. But if you knew where to look, you would see the subtle signs, the unnatural tightness of the barbed wire, the almost imperceptible hum that thrummed beneath the soil, and the array of colossal antennae that rose from the ground like skeletal, silent trees. They were massive, directional rhombic arrays, angled specifically, patiently, and relentlessly toward the eastern horizon, toward the vast, hostile landmass of the Soviet Union. True operational center was buried 50 feet below the damp turf. Protected by layers of concrete and lead shielding was a small cluster of underground rooms, the operational heart of Britain's signals intelligence SIGINT network, monitoring Soviet radio traffic 24/7. Operators called it the invisible station. Inside, atmosphere was one of permanent, controlled tension. The air was dry, filtered, and chilled by the massive cooling units required to keep the racks of thermionic valve equipment from overheating. The dominant sound was the continuous, hypnotic hiss of the static background, punctuated by the clicks, whistles, and occasional metallic squawk of shortwave radio traffic. Every sound, every flicker of the oscilloscope, was scrutinized, filtered, and analyzed. The entire Cold War, from this perspective, was a battle of frequencies. The Soviets were masters of encryption and radio discipline. They rarely made mistakes. The transmissions were supposed to be boilerplate, coded messages, weather reports, and the disciplined, impersonal chatter of the Soviet Air Force, the Voyeno-Vozdushny Sily (VVS). For months, the invisible station picked up nothing unusual. Sergeant Davies, a pale, chain-smoking signals intercept operator, had been on duty since 2100 hours. His headset was clamped tight, his eyes fixed on the green phosphor glow of the frequency meter. The routine was soul-numbing. Log the time, log the frequency, log the encryption type, and note any deviations. Davies knew the rhythm of the VVS like the beat of his own heart. He could distinguish the voice of a fighter pilot near Murmansk from a bomber squadron over the Baltic simply by the keying style of the Morse code. It was the usual symphony of Soviet efficiency. Routine messages, encrypted chatter, training flights, reporting altitude and vector changes with chilling, mechanical precision. L047 Greenwich Mean Time. Davies noticed it first on the spectrum analyzer. A small, secondary transmission, a high-frequency burst that shouldn't have been there, squeezed between two encrypted naval traffic channels. It was weak, almost buried in the noise, but it was transmitting voice, not code, and it wasn't filtered through the usual command network. It was pilot to ground, direct and panicked, the kind of raw, undisciplined transmission that the VVS would have shot a man for. Davies' hand shot out, his fingers expertly twisting the fine-tuning dial of the receiver. He adjusted the gain, fighting the noise, listening through the static like a man trying to hear a secret whispered across a continent. The voice that finally emerged was rough, breathless, and laced with an urgency that transcended the language barrier. Davies, who spoke fluent Russian, grabbed his tape recorder and slammed the record button. It was a Soviet pilot speaking in a tone Britain had never heard before. Terrified, personal, and utterly unprofessional. The pilot was clearly fighting the machine. The transmission was punctuated by sharp gasps of exertion. Quote, "Dane mogu. I can't. Vibracja cherezmerna. The vibration is excessive. Stabilizacja snova otkazala. Stabilization failed again." Davies felt a sudden, icy knot in his stomach. Stabilization failure. This suggested a serious problem with the tail or wing controls, likely at extreme performance. But then came the line that wasn't about the plane. It was about the system. Klasifizirovit rezultati. Classify results. Ne subschat. Polny dani o proizvoditelnosti. Do not report full performance data. The words hung in the stale, filtered air of the bunker. Do not report full performance data. The order was coming from the pilot, or perhaps a mission controller riding shotgun, not from a high command general. It was an immediate, visceral command to falsify the record, issued right as the machine was trying to shake itself apart. The British operators froze. This wasn't routine. This wasn't a glitch. This was a crack in the USSR's biggest aviation secret, the lie that underpinned their entire air superiority claim. And it came from a station that wasn't supposed to exist, listening to a message that was never supposed to be sent. Davies quickly isolated the frequency, recorded the exact time of intercept, and pressed the buzzer for the duty officer, his heart pounding a frantic counter rhythm to the hiss of the static. The game had just changed. The invisible station, Analysis Room 2 a.m., February 1952. The tape spool clicked quietly as it finished its slow rotation. Alistair Finch, the station's lead analyst, lifted the heavy, leather-encased headset from his ears. A man in his late 30s, Finch was characterized by the quiet, meticulous calm of someone who understood that the biggest threats rarely announced themselves with a bang, but with a whisper. He had been pulled from a quiet post at Bletchley Park after the war, genius for pattern recognition repurposed from Enigma to Soviet shortwave. Finch played the tape again, this time at half speed. Pilot's gasping Russian stretched into a haunting, drawn-out plea. Sergeant Davies sat opposite him, smoking and trying to keep his hands from shaking. The frequency, Finch murmured, tapping a long finger on the log sheet. It's one of their provisional tactical channels, used only for first flight shakedowns or experimental sorties. This was a test flight, Davies. Not a training exercise. A highly classified, high-stakes test. The transmission referenced a mysterious high-altitude test flight. The technical terms were scattered, flipped, and difficult to piece together, but the emotional content was crystal clear. Fear, disorientation, and intense physical stress. The pilot complained about violent shaking, oxygen starvation, and a sudden drop in control authority. Davies pointed to his transcription. Skarost, Odliknaya, no ne mogam derzot, glubinu. Speed is excellent, but we cannot maintain altitude depth. Finch translated the pilot's jargon in his head. Speed excellent. That meant the engine was performing. This was good news for the pilot, but terrible news for the man attempting to control the craft. If the speed was excellent and the machine was shaking, it meant the plane was being pushed past its aerodynamic limit. The details painted a vivid, horrifying picture of an aircraft battling the invisible demons of the high atmosphere. Violent shaking, aeroelastic flutter, the airframe was vibrating so intensely that structural failure was imminent. The shaking was likely caused by the leading edge of the wing being hammered by forming shockwaves as the plane approached the sound barrier. Oxygen starvation. The pilot was not in a fully pressurized suit or cockpit, or the system had failed under the stress. This suggested the jet was climbing to altitudes where a pressure failure meant rapid incapacitation, well above the standard operating ceiling. Drop in control authority, Mach tuck. This was the real killer. As a jet gets close to the speed of sound, the center of lift on the wing shifts abruptly backward. This effectively forces the nose down, giving the pilot the terrifying sensation that the controls have locked up and the plane is determined to dive straight into the ground. He was flying blind. Davies, Finch concluded, his voice low. He was fighting a Mach tuck and flutter at an altitude where his blood was boiling. He wasn't testing a plane. He was surviving a structural breakdown. But then came the line that changed everything, the phrase that lifted the conversation from a technical failure report to a high-level intelligence coup. Davies read it aloud from his transcript, his voice flat with realization. Official figures must remain as published. The air in the sterile room seemed to thicken. Britain had heard many things from Soviet pilots over the years, boasts, threats, and endless reports of political loyalty. But they had never heard them correct their own data mid-flight. They had never heard a pilot, on the edge of death, actively commanding his ground support to perpetuate a lie. The implication was staggering. The pilot's distress, the excessive vibration, the loss of control, this was the true performance data. They were commanded to maintain were the fabricated numbers, the propaganda, the capabilities Moscow insisted were real. Something was fundamentally wrong. The USSR's miracle fighter, the one they bragged could outrun and outclimb anything the West had, the machine that Western intelligence referred to as the Fago MiG-15, wasn't performing even close to their claim. Finch leaned back, running his hand through his thinning hair. Davies, if that plane was hitting Mach 0.9 and falling apart, and the pilot is telling the ground not to report it, then every piece of performance data we have on the MiG-15 is garbage. It's a bluff. The pilot wasn't afraid of the plane. He was afraid of the consequences of telling the truth. He knew that the only acceptable result was the published, fabricated statistic. His frantic message wasn't just a technical report, it was a desperate attempt to protect his neck and the necks of the engineers who designed the unstable monster. The invisible station had stumbled upon not just a technical flaw, but a systemic flaw. The Soviet Union was flying a war on paper, committing their airmen to machines whose actual flight envelope was smaller and deadlier than anyone in the West, or the East, had dared to suspect. Finch stood up, folding the transcription neatly. This goes to GCHQ, and then straight to the Prime Minister. This isn't just intelligence, Sergeant. This is an insurance policy. If their planes can't fly as fast as they claim, then the whole calculus of air defense over Europe changes. We have just found the true ceiling of the Red Air Force. And it's much lower than they want us to believe. The invisible station had found the USSR's best-kept secret. And that secret was simple. The Soviet fighter fleet was a lie. The initial shock of the first transmission, the pilot's panicked plea to falsify the data, had solidified into a relentless focus. The invisible station became a hawk fixed on a single, invisible target. Finch had redrawn the watch rotas, instructing every operator to prioritize the provisional tactical frequencies, even at the cost of neglecting standard encrypted traffic. They were no longer listening for secrets, they were listening for human frailty. The silence that followed the first great intercept lasted nearly a week, a pregnant pause that made the operators tense. Had the Soviets figured out the leak? Had the pilot been shot? Then, the fragments began to leak through the static again. Not in one clear message, but in a relentless trickle of mundane, logistical exchanges that, when pieced together, painted a picture of absolute chaos and systematic deception. First leak. The emergency grounding. The first solid piece of evidence arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Sergeant Davies, still anchored to the prime frequency, heard a rapid-fire exchange on an airbase control channel, one used primarily for ground traffic and maintenance. It was a call from the airfield commander to the maintenance chief, bypassing the usual protocol. The voice was gruff, furious, and stressed. "We have another one inbound, 200 kilometers out. Landing gear damaged. Hydraulic pressure at 0. Prepare for foam-down landing. And I want the strip cleared of personnel, immediately. This is a Priority 1 incident. Do not record the aircraft type in the open log. Mark it as Foreign Object Impact Drill." Davies immediately cross-referenced the flight ID. It was the same design bureau, the same experimental callsign series as the first panicked pilot. The hydraulic failure was crucial. At extreme high Mach flight, the G-forces exerted on the tailplane and ailerons are immense. If the plane was experiencing the Mach tuck and the violent buffeting described earlier, it could have stressed the hydraulic lines beyond their breaking point, even in a system designed to handle high pressure. An emergency, foam-down landing, the procedure for a plane expected to crash or explode upon impact, was being disguised as a training drill. This wasn't a minor failure. It was a plane being totaled by its own performance envelope. Second leak. The compressor stall. The next leak was auditory, not linguistic. The operators picked up a high-altitude transmission, a pilot trying to report his position, that ended in a terrifying sound, the high-pitched shriek of a jet engine, followed by a violent, sputtering whoop. It was the unmistakable sound of a compressor stall. A compressor stall occurs when the air flowing into the jet engine's intake and through its compression stages becomes unstable, leading to a rapid, catastrophic loss of thrust. In early jets, this was often triggered by pushing the engine too hard at high altitudes where the air is thin and cold, or by a sudden change in airflow, exactly what happens when a shockwave forms on the wing and slams into the engine intake. The pilot's voice, once the engine caught again, was clipped and tight. He merely reported, "Minor fluctuation in power. Resumed standard thrust," but the recording proved otherwise. The minor fluctuation had been a full-scale engine seizure at 40,000 feet, a near-death experience disguised by a bland phrase of compliance. It demonstrated that the engine, designed to power the super fighter, couldn't handle the altitudes it was designed to reach. Third leak. The altitude limit and pilot refusal. The logs accumulated further. A persistent pattern emerged, demonstrating altitude limits far below Soviet propaganda. The official specifications boasted a ceiling exceeding 55,000 feet, a height that placed the fighter above most NATO bombers. The intercepted flight plans, however, showed a persistent ceiling for these experimental flights of 45,000 feet, and increasingly, pilots were ordered to abort their climb around 42,000. The most damning piece of human intelligence came from an indirect communication, a tense, private channel exchange between a flight scheduler and a test pilot identified as Sokol, Falcon. Scheduler, harsh, Sokol, your flight window is tomorrow at 0800. Repeat profile Charlie 9. Sokol, tired comrade, my flight window is closed. Request medical leave. My paperwork cites acute ear infection and vestibular disturbance. The British analysts knew vestibular disturbance was military code for G-force sickness, or simply a deep, psychological fear of the machine. Test pilots refusing repeat flights, not because the machine broke, but because they broke, was the ultimate indictment of the design. They were physically and mentally exhausted by the violence of the flight. The pilots knew the official envelope was a lie. The technicians, confession. The evidence shifted from the cockpit to the workbench when the final, critical intercept arrived. This time, the voice was not a pilot or a commander, but a low-ranking technician, speaking quickly, nervously, and in the technical jargon of the instrument calibration lab. He was speaking to a colleague about data review procedures. The telemetry from Sokol's 0800 flight shows peak Mach at 0.94. The vibration curve is off the chart. Do we follow the new directive, or the old one? Colleague. Follow the new directive, Vanya. If the airframe integrity is violated above Mach 0.88, you normalize the curve. The maximum recorded speed is 0.87. Recordings will be altered before submission. You know this as the instruction from the Central Committee. The sheer, staggering implication hung in the air. This wasn't just a flawed aircraft. This was a systematic cover-up mandated by the highest levels of the party. The new directive was a political mandate. The designers, under pressure from the Kremlin, were not just ignoring their failures, they were fabricating their successes. Every piece of paper detailing the MiG's superior performance was a lie created in a dark little room by a nervous technician named Vanya. The invisible station had stumbled onto something bigger than a test failure. They had found the administrative procedure for treason. The USSR's best-kept secret wasn't a new super fighter. It was that the old one didn't work at all. GCHQ headquarters, Cheltenham, April 1952. The raw transcripts, bundled into a classified file stamped, Ultra Garden, were hand-delivered to the highest offices in the UK. The analysis team, led by Alistair Finch, was brought in from the coast, blinked in the fluorescent light of the GCHQ war rooms, and prepared to present the full picture. Analysts quickly realized the immense strategic value of what was happening. They weren't just decoding radio traffic, they were decoding the Soviet military mindset. For years, Western intelligence had been forced to rely on two unreliable sources: public Soviet propaganda and defector testimony. The propaganda claimed godlike performance. The defectors, often low-ranking and eager to please, gave contradictory, confused numbers. NATO air planning was cautious, assuming the worst, that the MiGs were as fast and high-flying as the Soviets claimed. The enemy's greatest weapon was the fear of the unknown. But the radio logs, the unfiltered, guttural whispers of men in crisis, told the real story. The ceiling myth. The Soviets had spent years promoting a high-altitude interceptor that supposedly surpassed Western performance. The transcripts confirmed it couldn't reach its advertised ceiling without the engine stalling and the cockpit losing pressure. At 55,000 feet, the MiG wasn't a fighter, it was a falling rock. The speed trap. It became dangerously unstable at operational speeds, specifically, the high transonic regime between Mach 0.88 and 0.94. This was the death zone, where the Mach tuck killed control authority and aeroelastic flutter destroyed the airframe. The MiG was a formidable low-altitude dogfighter, but its high-speed promise was based on fabricated charts. The engine liability. The engine overheated and choked at the very altitudes the West's latest strategic bomber, the B-47 Stratojet, could reach easily. The Soviet pilot couldn't maintain the chase for more than a few minutes without risking a full-scale stall or a fire. The super fighter, the icon of Soviet industrial might, was nowhere near the numbers they publicly declared. It was a bluff designed to terrify bomber crews. The intelligence was staggering. It confirmed that the Soviet military-industrial complex was more vulnerable to ideological demands than to aerodynamic reality. Finch presented a summary map to the assembled generals. He showed the projected flight paths of NATO bombers versus the actual, proven, non-suicidal flight envelope of the Soviet interceptor fleet. The discrepancy was huge. The MiGs were not a high-altitude threat. Gentlemen, Finch stated calmly, adjusting his glasses, we have confirmation. Their most important operational boast is a lie of at least 15% in ceiling and potentially 10% in top speed. This aircraft, the pride of the VVS, can be safely outflown by our new generation of bombers simply by cruising above 45,000 feet and holding a straight line. Britain now held proof that the USSR's strongest aviation boast, the bedrock of their entire air defense strategy, the high-flying, unstoppable interceptor, was a myth. It was a paper tiger, grounded by the very physics the Soviets claimed to have mastered. The true genius of the discovery lay in its source. It came not from a massive infiltration or a captured spy, but from a listening post the Soviets didn't even know existed, an invisible station tucked away in a muddy field in Suffolk, patiently gathering the scattered, human fallout of a lie too large to contain. It was a triumph of technology and patience, proving that in the Cold War, the smallest, most ignored voice could carry the weight of the greatest truth. The constant pressure of maintaining a lie is an exhausting thing. For the engineers, it meant constantly altering logs, recalculating theoretical maximums, and justifying metal fatigue with spurious explanations about atmospheric humidity. For the commanders, it meant issuing orders they knew were impossible to fulfill. But for the men in the cockpits, the ones strapped into the trembling, violent manifestation of the deception, the pressure was physical, psychological, and ultimately unbearable. The invisible station had tracked the gradual degradation of morale for weeks. They had logs showing Sokol, claiming fake ear infections, and Oral, Eagle, citing spurious fuel line blockages. The Soviet Test Pilot Corps, a group of men selected for their nerve and loyalty, was cracking under the realization that their government had prioritized political optics over their lives. One night, the culmination of that stress, that systemic failure, broke through the static with the force of an uncontrolled explosion. The night was cold and clear over the remote Soviet test ranges east of the Urals. The experimental jet, a new variant designed to fix the transonic instability, was on its 10th attempt to hold a sustained speed of Mach 0.9 for longer than 60 seconds at 40,000 feet. The pilot was a man named Yuri, a veteran of the Korean conflict who had once believed in the invincibility of the Red Air Force. He was exhausted, his voice already hoarse from the constant demands of the high-altitude environment. Inside the invisible station, Sergeant Davies was on duty again. He had grown gaunt from the stress of hunting these ghosts in the machine. Night, the primary tactical frequency was buzzing with low-level, encrypted data bursts from the flight. Everything looked normal. The readings, the Fs, were smooth. Yuri was reporting steady acceleration. Then, the data stream vanished. Not a power failure. Not a simple equipment glitch. The telemetry link was deliberately, manually killed. And into the sudden silence, over the provisional voice channel, came the unfiltered, raw terror of a man past the point of no return. Yuri was screaming, his voice distorted by the tight oxygen mask, the sound of the high Mach airflow tearing at the canopy a violent, tearing hiss in the background. K. Komandir, Ya Goryu, Ya ne Nayu, Kakuyu Skurost. Commander, I am burning. I do not know the speed. Vibratsia, ukodit. The vibration. It's leaving. The vibration wasn't leaving. It was accelerating into a harmonic frequency so high that the human ear could no longer register it as shaking, but as a low, resonant drone. Yuri was experiencing the final stage of transonic flutter, the point where the airframe begins to tear itself apart, often mistaken for a sudden, eerie calm. The flight controller, frantic, shouted back an instruction. Yuri, follow standard protocol. Report Mach 0.85. Report stable flight. And that was when Yuri broke. The sheer, overwhelming reality of the violence surrounding him, contrasted with the desperate plea to tell a simple, idiotic lie, shattered his discipline. He didn't acknowledge the order. Instead, he pulled his mask down, the muffled sound of his breath replaced by a roar of raw, unprocessed air and human rage. Slushie menya, hear me. Vse vruchio, ya lechu na polnoi skurosti, I my raspatiemsia. It's all a lie. I am flying at full speed, and we are breaking apart. Esli zapad kogdo libo usly shidito, oni uznai visio. If the West ever hears this, they will know everything. My ne godovi. We are not ready. The transmission ended with a sickening, grinding sound, the noise of tearing metal and the sudden silence of a radio connection lost forever. Yuri's machine, unable to sustain the lie, had disintegrated into the night sky. Britain did hear it. Sergeant Davies had been transcribing the stream with a shaking hand, the keys of his typewriter clacking out the raw, profane confession of a collapsing superpower. Every word was captured, every gasp, every crackle of breaking metal. And that single transmission confirmed the entire truth. The USSR's flagship fighter program was failing, and the Kremlin was terrified the world would find out. Yuri's final scream was not just the cry of a dying man, it was the ultimate intelligence coup. It validated every single intercepted fragment, every forced foam-down landing, every faked sensor reading. The lie was not a local administrative problem, it was the official, codified policy of the Soviet state. The invisible station had exposed something no spy network had managed to uncover. Not what the Soviets were building, which was already known through other channels, but what they were hiding. They were hiding the limits of their own ambition, the weakness of their own metallurgy, and the failure of their political ideology to conquer the immutable laws of aerodynamics. The men in Suffolk looked at the transcript, and they realized they hadn't just intercepted a flight log. They had captured a moment of systemic treason, delivered unwittingly by a loyal man who could no longer bear the weight of his country's deception. The air superiority of the Soviet Union was not built on concrete and steel, but on a bluff, backed by the lives of men like Yuri. The Pentagon, Washington, D.C. Summer 1952. The intelligence packet arrived in Washington via diplomatic pouch, traveling under maximum security. It was not labeled MiG-15 performance data. It was labeled Ultra Garden, Systemic Integrity Assessment. It contained the transcripts, the spectrum analysis, and the technical breakdown prepared by Alistair Finch. The British never revealed the source, never claimed public credit, never admitted the station existed. This was the quiet triumph of the Cold War. To expose a secret of this magnitude would force the Soviets to immediately fix the problem and, more importantly, change their radio protocols, thus blinding the invisible station forever. The real value of the intelligence was not in having it, but in using it silently. The intelligence quietly reshaped NATO strategy with the elegance and efficiency of a chess master moving a single, crucial piece. The strategic shift. For years, the US and Britain had allocated massive budgets to defensive fighter escorts, assuming their bombers needed protection against the terrifying Soviet interceptor capabilities. The assumption was simple. The MiGs could reach the B-47 Stratojet and the upcoming B-52 at their cruising altitude. Now, everything changed. Budgets shifted. Funds earmarked for high-speed interceptors were quietly diverted into electronic countermeasures (ECM) and, crucially, into high-altitude engine performance research for bombers. Why spend billions chasing the MiG's hypothetical speed when you could simply fly above its proven, lethal ceiling? Threat assessments changed. The MiG-15 was downgraded from a high-altitude high-speed to a medium-altitude high-subsonic threat. NATO war planners realized the only place the Soviets could fight effectively was below 35,000 feet. The vast, empty upper atmosphere became the strategic sanctuary for Western deterrence. Western designers realized they were far ahead. The data confirmed that American and British engineers were not just competing, they were operating on an entirely different plane of reality. The US had already mastered the all-flying tail, and was deep into the research for Richard Whitcomb's area rule, the fundamental design principle that would allow jets to break the sound barrier smoothly. The Soviets, by contrast, were still covering up the inability of their swept-wing design to simply fly straight. The most immediate change was in the briefing rooms of Strategic Air Command (SAC). Bomber pilots were instructed, without elaborate explanation, to maintain cruising altitudes above 45,000 feet. They were told that enemy interception would be highly improbable above this line. The anxiety that had pervaded the SAC command structure, the fear that every bomber run into Soviet airspace would be a suicide mission, receded. The sky was suddenly larger, and far safer, than they had ever believed. The quiet triumph, the invisible station, still humming quietly on the Suffolk coast, became the linchpin of the West's air strategy. For the next decade, its operators continued to listen, using the Soviets' established, flawed radio discipline against them. Every altered log, every emergency transmission, every shouted curse confirmed that the lie was still in place. The Americans and the British didn't have to build a plane to beat the MiG. They just needed to know the MiG couldn't fly where it was supposed to. Britain didn't outfly the USSR. It simply outlistened them. The final irony was that the Soviet Union, driven by the desperation Yuri had screamed into the night, spent the next 8 years and untold resources to fix the problem, convinced that the West was already flying planes that could hit Mach 2. The race to develop the MiG-19 and the MiG-21 was a race against a phantom threat, a threat created by their own deception, exposed by the final words of a broken man. The base without a name, the invisible station, had caught a Soviet whisper that was never meant to be heard. Its true victory was not a dramatic dogfight in the sky, but the quiet, strategic recalibration of the entire Western world, all thanks to the simple truth: in the greatest conflict of the age, silence was the loudest weapon.